Welcome back to Beyond Midnight, where we peel back the layers of romanticized history, exposing the gristle and bone beneath the polished facade. Tonight, we embark on a journey not of valor and glory, but of mud, blood, and the agonizing certainty of oblivion. Tonight, we ask a question that, if you're honest with yourself, you've probably entertained in some fleeting moment of fantasy. Could you survive a medieval battle? The short answer, unvarnished and brutal, is no. You wouldn't. And by the time we're done here, delving into the grim mechanics of such an encounter, you'll understand precisely why that is an undeniable, horrifying truth. Forget the cinematic charges, the duels of honor, the perfectly choreographed sword fights that grace your streaming cues. Cast aside the image of a lone, heroic figure cleaving through dozens of foes with a gleaming blade. That is a comforting fiction, a narrative balm for the uncomfortable reality of what it truly meant to stand on a field of slaughter in the High Middle Ages. Your modern sensibilities, your physical conditioning, your very understanding of pain and sanitation would not merely be disadvantages. They would be the instruments of your swift and agonizing demise. Let us begin not with the clash of steel, but with the insidious creep of inevitability that precedes it. You, a person of the modern age, accustomed to a balanced diet, readily available medical care, and a general expectation of personal hygiene, would likely be dead long before you ever saw the enemy's banner. Consider the march. Armies in the medieval period did not teleport. They walked, for weeks, sometimes months, across unforgiving terrain. Imagine yourself, dressed in whatever rudimentary gear you could scrounge or were issued, a rough wool tunic, perhaps some ill-fitting leather, certainly not the bespoke, lightweight materials you're used to. Your footwear, if you even had proper boots, would be crude, unyielding. Blisters would form within hours, then burst, then fester, becoming open sores attracting flies and infection in the dust and grime. Your diet, a monotonous, insufficient ration of hardtack, dried meat, perhaps some stale bread if you were lucky. Water would be drawn from contaminated streams, shared from communal buckets. Dysentery, that silent, relentless killer, would sweep through the ranks like wildfire. Your digestive system, accustomed to pasteurized milk and filtered water, would revolt. Dehydration would set in, followed by cramps, nausea, and the debilitating weakness that accompanies constant purging. You'd be emptying your bowels multiple times a day, your energy draining with each bout, your body wasting away. And this is before you even sniff the enemy. Disease, not the sword, was the primary architect of medieval military casualties. Measles, smallpox, typhus, influenza, diseases that modern medicine has largely tamed or eradicated, would run rampant through the crowded, unsanitary camps. Imagine sleeping shoulder to shoulder with hundreds, if not thousands, of other men, many of whom are already sick, coughing, sneezing, excreting. The air would be thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, human waste, and the sickly sweet smell of decay from those who had already succumbed. A simple cold for you could escalate into pneumonia, a cough into consumption. Without antibiotics, without even a basic understanding of germ theory, a minor infection could swiftly become a death sentence. Your immune system, coddled by a lifetime of vaccinations and clean living, would be utterly unprepared for this bacterial and viral onslaught. You would be a walking Petri dish, ripe for any passing contagion. Even if by some miracle you survived the march, the dysentery, and the camp diseases, you'd arrive at the battlefield a shadow of your former self, emaciated, exhausted, perpetually hungry, and quite possibly feverish. Your mental state, too, would be fractured. The constant fear, the lack of privacy, the incessant noise, the pervasive stench of unwashed humanity and death, it would chip away at your sanity. You would be a stranger to yourself, a hollowed-out vessel of anxiety and dread. Now let us place you on the battlefield itself, on the cusp of engagement. It is not a flat, manicured lawn. It is a field, often recently plowed or churned by thousands of feet and hooves. It is uneven, riddled with ruts, rocks, and hidden holes. If it has rained, it is a quagmire, a sucking, energy-draining bog that will cling to your every step. If it is dry, the ground will be hard, unforgiving, and within moments of the armies engaging, a thick, choking dust will rise, obscuring vision, coating your throat and lungs, mingling with the sweat and grime on your face. The air, forget the clean, filtered air of your climate-controlled existence. The air on a medieval battlefield would be a noxious cocktail. The acrid tang of fear-induced sweat, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the pungent reek of human waste from men who have lost control of their bladders and bowels in sheer terror. Add to this the smell of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and the heavy, earthy odor of the churned soil. Later, when the battle is truly joined, the air will thicken with the smell of scorched earth from fires, the coppery tang of vast quantities of spilled blood, and the sickly sweet, cloying smell of eviscerated flesh. It would be an assault on your most primal senses, a visceral warning of the horror to come. The sound, oh the sound. It would be a cacophony designed to shatter the very foundations of your being. Not the orderly, distant booms of modern artillery, but a raw, primal scream. The rhythmic thud of thousands of marching feet growing louder, faster. The shrill, piercing wail of trumpets and horns, signaling commands, escalating the tension. The guttural shouts and roars of men attempting to intimidate, to steal their own nerves. The nervous whinnying of horses, their hooves churning the ground. Then as the lines draw closer, the sickening wet thud of arrows impacting flesh, the splintering crack of shields, the dull clang of steel on steel, the sharp tearing sound of fabric ripping, and then the screams. Not the brief, theatrical screams of cinema, but prolonged, agonizing shrieks of pain, of terror, of despair. The gurgling cries of men drowning in their own blood, the choked gasps of those suffocating beneath a pile of bodies. The sheer volume would be deafening, disorienting, a sonic assault that would strip away your ability to think, to reason, to react. Now consider your equipment. You're not wearing modern tactical gear. You might have a padded gambeson, a thick quilted jacket, hot and restrictive. Perhaps a simple helmet, an open-faced kettle hat offering minimal protection to your face. Maybe a leather jerkin. Forget plate armor. That was for the wealthy elite, and even then it was heavy, hot, and required immense training to fight effectively in. You, a common foot soldier, would be lucky to have a shield, probably made of wood, covered in leather, perhaps with a simple boss. It would be heavy, cumbersome, and prone to splintering. Your weapon, not a finely balanced, razor-sharp longsword. That again was a luxury. You'd likely be armed with a spear, a long pole of wood tipped with a leaf-shaped or spike-like head of iron, or perhaps an axe, a heavy, unwieldy tool designed for splitting wood as much as skulls, or a billhook, a repurposed agricultural implement. These were not weapons of finesse, but of brute force, designed to hack, to thrust, to bludgeon. They were extensions of the user's raw strength, and in your untrained hands, they would feel like light, clumsy, and ineffective. The charge, this is where the true terror begins. You are part of a mass of humanity, shoulder to shoulder, pushing forward. There is no room for individual maneuver. You are a cog in a machine, propelled by the momentum of the men behind you. Your vision is limited to the back of the man in front, the ground beneath your feet, and the terrifying, advancing mass of the enemy. Panic would be a cold, clammy hand gripping your gut. Your heart would be a frantic drum against your ribs. Your breath would come in ragged gasps. Every instinct would scream at you to flee, but you cannot. The men behind you are pushing, the officers are shouting, and the enemy is drawing closer, their weapons glinting in the light, their faces contorted into masks of grim determination or pure, unadulterated rage. The collision, it is not a graceful impact. It is a sickening, bone-jarring crash. The push of pike was a literal term. Imagine two immense, living walls, each armed with long, sharp poles slamming into each other. It's not about individual combat at this stage. It's about sheer collective force. You are pressed, crushed, suffocated by the weight of bodies around you. The man next to you screams as a spear finds his throat. The man behind you stumbles, pushing you forward off balance. You are not fighting. You are struggling to remain upright, to breathe, to avoid being trampled underfoot. Your spear, if you still have it, becomes a clumsy, unwieldy burden. You try to thrust, but there's no room. You try to swing, but you're hemmed in. The enemy's spears are probing, seeking gaps in the line, seeking soft flesh. You might feel a sharp sting, a dull ache, then a searing pain as a point finds your arm, your leg, your side. The wound, even a shallow one, would bleed freely, soaking your crude clothing, chilling you, weakening you. And the pain. Without modern pain relief, it would be all-consuming, a fire in your veins, threatening to overwhelm your senses. The melee, if you survive the initial impact and are not immediately impaled or trampled, you are now in the heart of the maelstrom. This is not a place for skill, but for brutal, desperate survival. The lines have broken down, dissolving into a chaotic, swirling mass of bodies. You are surrounded. Enemies are on all sides, obscured by the dust, the sweat, the sheer press of bodies. Your vision is limited to a few feet around you. Your hearing is overwhelmed by the din. A sword, dull and heavy, swings towards your head. You raise your shield, but the impact jars your arm, sending a shockwave up to your shoulder. The wood splinters, cracks, another blow, and the shield is useless, hanging by a strap or ripped from your grasp. Now you are exposed. You might try to parry with your spear, but it's too long for close quarters. You drop it, instinctively reaching for a smaller weapon, a knife perhaps, or a broken piece of your shield. The fighting is not clean. It is hacking, slashing, thrusting. It is desperate, ugly, and utterly devoid of anything resembling honor. Men are not aiming for elegant disarms or precise thrusts. They are aiming for anything that bleeds, anything that breaks. The face, the throat, the groin, the knees, the armpits, any exposed flesh. You see a flash of steel, and the man next to you gurgles, clutching his stomach as his entrails begin to spill onto the mud. Another man collapses with a sickening crunch as an axe cleaves his skull. You are not fighting one person. You are fighting the crushing, suffocating chaos itself. Your physical conditioning, even if you were an elite athlete in your own time, would be irrelevant. The weight of your rudimentary gear, the constant exertion, the sheer terror, it would drain your stamina in minutes. Your muscles would burn, your lungs would ache, and your limbs would feel like lead. You would be breathing in great, ragged gulps, your throat raw, your mouth dry. And the adrenaline, which might give you a brief burst of strength, would quickly give way to debilitating exhaustion, leaving you vulnerable, shaky, and prone to error. Consider the nature of the wounds. A sword, even a dull one, could inflict terrible gashes, severing tendons, muscles, even limbs. An axe blow could shatter bone, leaving compound fractures where the bone protrudes through the skin. A mace or warhammer, designed for blunt trauma, could crush skulls, break ribs, pulverize joints, causing internal bleeding that would kill you slowly and agonizingly. Arrows, fired in volleys, would rain down from above, silent and deadly. An arrow could penetrate your crude armor, pierce your lung, or pin you to the ground. Even if it didn't kill you instantly, the barbed head would be difficult to remove, and the wound would almost certainly become infected. The pain, it would be beyond anything you have ever experienced. Imagine a searing, burning agony that consumes your entire being. No painkillers, no morphine, no numbing agents. Just the raw, unadulterated sensation of flesh tearing, bone splintering, nerves screaming. Shock would set in, but it might not be enough to dull the edges of the torment. You might lie there, bleeding out, conscious, for hours, listening to the sounds of the battle rage around you, or the screams of others who share your fate. And then there's the psychological toll, the sheer, overwhelming horror of it all. The sight of your comrades being dismembered, their faces contorted in agony, the smell of blood and fear. The realization that your life, which you value so highly, is utterly meaningless in this maelstrom, a mere flicker in the vast, indifferent expanse of human suffering. Panic would be a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of your sanity. You might freeze, unable to move, a prime target. You might try to flee, only to be cut down from behind or trampled by the surging mass. You might simply break, your mind unable to process the inhumanity of it all, descending into a primal state of terror and despair. Even if you managed to inflict a wound, to strike down an enemy, the act itself would be profoundly traumatizing. The feel of your weapon biting into flesh, the sound of a dying gasp, the sight of life draining from another human being's eyes, it is not something you are conditioned for. Your modern moral compass, your ingrained respect for human life would be shattered. You would be forced to commit acts of horrific violence simply to survive another minute, acts that would haunt you, if you lived, for the rest of your days. Let us consider the role of cavalry. If you were a foot soldier, the sight of a massed cavalry charge would be enough to make your blood run cold. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of heavily armored riders on powerful warhorses, thundering towards your position. The ground would literally shake beneath your feet. The sound of their hooves would be like an approaching storm, growing louder, more terrifying with every second. You, a mere mortal, would be facing the equivalent of a medieval tank. Your spear, if you still had it and had the training, might be used to brace against the charge, to create a bristling wall of points. But even then, the sheer weight and momentum of a charging horse and rider could break through any line. Imagine being struck by a ton of enraged animal and armored man moving at full gallop. You would be pulverized, trampled into the mud, your bones shattered, your body reduced to an unrecognizable pulp. The fear of being ridden down, of being crushed beneath those iron-shod hooves, would be absolute and paralyzing. Even if you were not directly hit, the sheer concussive force, the dust, the chaos, would be enough to send you sprawling, leaving you vulnerable to the next wave of attack, or to the swords of the dismounted cavalrymen who would follow, finishing off the fallen. And what of the arrows and bolts that would rain down from the sky, not just from archers on the ground, but from skirmishers, from crossbowmen, from longbowmen positioned to loose volleys into the densest parts of the enemy formation? You wouldn't see them coming. You would hear a distant thrumming, a whistling sound, and then they would be among you. Arrows are not like bullets. They do not pass cleanly through. They embed, they splinter, they carry fragments of clothing and dirt deep into the wound, ensuring infection. An arrow to the eye, the throat, the groin, a swift, brutal end. An arrow to the limb, and you are incapacitated, bleeding, waiting for someone to finish you off, or for the battle to move on, leaving you to a slow, agonizing death on the field. There is no safe place on a medieval battlefield. No cover, no concealment in the modern sense. You are exposed, a target in a vast, open killing field. Even if you sought refuge behind a pile of bodies, the enemy would simply move on, or worse, find you and dispatch you with a swift blow, unwilling to leave any potential threat alive. Let's consider the aftermath, assuming, against all odds, you are not dead, not mortally wounded, not captured. The battle is over. The screaming has subsided, replaced by the moans of the dying. The air is thick with the stench of blood, excrement, and death. The ground is a charnel house, littered with dismembered bodies, shattered weapons, and the detritus of human conflict. Looters would descend like vultures, stripping the dead and dying of anything of value, armor, weapons, even clothing. If you were merely wounded, you would be at their mercy. They might finish you off for your boots, or leave you to blade out, uncaring. Medical care, as we've touched upon, was rudimentary at best. If you were lucky enough to be brought to a field surgeon, often a barber surgeon, a man with a sharp knife and little understanding of anatomy or hygiene, your chances of survival would still be slim. Imagine a compound fracture, the bone protruding through the skin. The surgeon, with unwashed hands and a rusty saw, might attempt to set it, or more likely, amputate the limb. Without anesthesia, you would be fully conscious, screaming in agony as the saw bit through bone. The stump would be cauterized with a red-hot iron, a crude attempt to stop the bleeding, but also an open invitation for infection. Gangrene, sepsis, these were not abstract terms. They were the grim realities that followed almost any serious wound. A fever would set in, your body fighting a losing battle against the bacterial invasion, and you would waste away, succumbing to the very pathogens that modern medicine conquers with a simple pill. Even a seemingly minor wound, a cut or a puncture, could become a festering sore, leading to blood poisoning. The lack of sterile instruments, the use of unboiled water, the application of poultices made from dubious ingredients, every intervention was a gamble, often making things worse. You would likely die not from the initial wound, but from the infection that inevitably followed, a slow, agonizing decline marked by fever, delirium, and unbearable pain. And if you were captured, your fate would be equally bleak. If you were a common soldier, you had little ransom value. You might be summarily executed, a quick sword thrust to the throat to save resources. Or you might be enslaved, forced to labor in the victor's lands, your life reduced to brutal servitude. If you were lucky, you might be released, stripped of all your possessions, to wander the ravaged countryside, a survivor perhaps, but a broken one. The psychological scars, if you somehow emerged from this nightmare alive and relatively intact, would be profound. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the acts you witnessed and perhaps committed, they would be etched into your memory, replaying in an endless loop. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder would have been a common, debilitating affliction. Nightmares, flashbacks, an inability to connect with others, a pervasive sense of dread and anxiety, these would be your constant companions. You would be forever changed, a hollowed-out version of the person you once were, haunted by the ghosts of the battlefield. The sheer randomness of death would also be a constant source of dread. You could be the most skilled warrior, the most agile, the most courageous, and still be struck down by a stray arrow, crushed by a falling horse, or simply pushed into a ditch and suffocated by the press of bodies. There was no fairness, no justice, no logic to who lived and who died. It was a brutal lottery, and the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against you. Your knowledge of modern tactics, of military history, would be utterly useless. The medieval battlefield was not a place for individual brilliance, but for collective endurance, for brutal, grinding attrition. Your understanding of logistics, of supply chains, of morale, would offer no practical benefit in the face of dysentery, a charging knight, or a volleys of arrows. You are not a commander. You are a grunt, a disposable piece of flesh in a meat grinder. Even your understanding of the world, your fundamental worldview, would be challenged and broken. The medieval mind was steeped in superstition, in religious fervor, in a belief system that saw divine intervention in every success and failure. Your rational, scientific mind would struggle to comprehend the unquestioning faith, the brutal justice, the lack of empathy that characterized so much of the era. This cultural chasm would further isolate you, making you an outsider, an alien in a world that would chew you up and spit you out. So when you next watch a historical drama or play a video game set in the medieval period, take a moment. Strip away the Hollywood sheen, the heroic music, the convenient plot armor. Imagine yourself there, not as a protagonist, but as a terrified, ill-equipped, disease-ridden foot soldier, standing in the mud and the blood, surrounded by chaos and death. Imagine the smells, the sounds, the sheer, unimaginable pain. Imagine the cold grip of fear, the burning in your lungs, the weakness in your limbs. Imagine the agonizing wait for death, or the slow, painful recovery from wounds that would be trivial in your own time. It is a sobering thought, isn't it? A stark reminder that the past, for all its romantic allure, was a brutal, unforgiving place, especially for those caught in the maelstrom of war. Your modern life, with its comforts, its medicines, its expectations of safety and hygiene, has utterly unfitted you for such an existence. You are a creature of a different age, and that age would offer you no quarter on the medieval field of battle. The statistics, the historical accounts, the very grim mechanics of medieval warfare all point to one inescapable conclusion: you would not survive. You would not last an hour, perhaps not even a minute, before succumbing to fear, exhaustion, disease, or the brutal, unyielding force of a world utterly alien to your own. And this, remember, is just one aspect of the pervasive lethality of the medieval world. The dangers extended far beyond the battlefield, into every facet of daily life, where survival itself was a constant, precarious struggle against forces we have long since tamed. But that, my friends, is a story for another time, for another dark hour. For now, consider this horrifying truth and understand that the past is not merely a different time, but a different species of reality altogether. The medieval battlefield, as we have meticulously dissected, was a crucible of death, a place where your modern existence would be extinguished with brutal efficiency. But to confine the dangers of the medieval world solely to its martial conflicts would be a profound oversight, a failure to grasp the pervasive, insidious lethality that permeated every facet of daily life. For even if you somehow managed to evade the recruitment levy, to escape the mustering of armies, to live out your days far from the clang of steel and the cries of the dying, you would still find yourself utterly unprepared for the grinding, relentless struggle for mere existence that defined the medieval era. Your very body, accustomed to the antiseptic bubble of the 21st century, would be a fragile, vulnerable vessel, prone to collapse under the weight of conditions that were, for the people of that time, simply the unremarkable backdrop of their lives. Let us consider for a moment the air you would breathe, the water you would drink, the food you would consume, not in the artificial construct of a military camp, but in the heart of a bustling medieval town or a quiet agrarian village. Sanitation, as we understand it, was a concept utterly alien. Rivers, which often served as sources of drinking water, were simultaneously used as open sewers, carrying the waste of entire communities downstream. Human and animal excrement would be deposited in privies, pits, or simply cast into the streets, where it would mingle with mud, refuse, and the carcasses of dead animals. The air, especially in urban centers, would be thick with the stench of decomposition, of unwashed bodies, of stale ale, of burning wood and dung. Your sensitive modern nose, accustomed to the faint, often pleasant odors of your filtered world, would be assaulted by a constant, overwhelming miasma. You would breathe in airborne pathogens with every breath, your lungs, accustomed to clean air, struggling against the constant irritation of smoke from open fires, dust, and the microscopic detritus of a profoundly unsanitary environment. Your personal hygiene would be a concept of morbid amusement to the people of the age. Regular bathing, with soap and warm, clean water, was a luxury for the very few, and even then often infrequent. For the vast majority, a quick wash of the face and hands, perhaps once a day, with cold, often contaminated water, would be the extent of their ablutions. Body odor would be pervasive, a constant companion. Skin infections, rashes, boils, and sores would be common, exacerbated by constant friction from rough clothing and the lack of effective antiseptics. Lice, fleas, and other parasites would be an inescapable part of life, colonizing your hair, your clothing, your bedding. Imagine the constant itching, the discomfort, the skin irritation, the diseases these vectors could transmit. You would be a walking ecosystem for various minute creatures, a concept utterly repellent to your modern sensibilities. And the food, oh the food, forget the varied, nutrient-rich diet you take for granted. For the vast majority, the diet was monotonous and often deficient. Grains, wheat, rye, barley, oats formed the absolute staple, consumed as bread, porridge, or ale. Vegetables were seasonal, often limited to root crops and cabbages. Meat was a rare luxury for the common folk, reserved for feast days or after a successful hunt, and even then often poorly preserved. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. Meat would be salted, smoked, or dried, often to the point of being incredibly tough and chewy. Grains would be stored in barns, vulnerable to rodents and insects, and often contaminated with their droppings. Ergotism, a horrifying disease caused by a fungus that grows on rye, could lead to hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death, a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers in the most basic foodstuffs. Malnutrition would be widespread. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals would lead to a host of debilitating conditions: rickets, scurvy, pellagra, night blindness. Your teeth, accustomed to fluoridated water and regular dental checkups, would rapidly decay. Without proper dental hygiene or the ability to fill cavities, toothaches would be a common, agonizing torment. Abscesses would form, leading to infections that could spread to your jaw, your brain, or your bloodstream, a slow and excruciating path to death. Imagine the constant, dull ache of chronic pain, exacerbated by the sharp, piercing agony of an infected tooth, with no relief beyond prayer or perhaps a crude, painful extraction by a blacksmith or barber. Then there is the omnipresent specter of disease. We speak of the Black Death as a singular, catastrophic event, and indeed it was. But even in its absence, the medieval world was a relentless incubator of pathogens. Smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, dysentery, influenza, typhus, malaria in certain regions. These were not historical footnotes. They were daily realities, constantly circulating, constantly claiming lives. A simple cold could escalate into pneumonia, a minor cut into a fatal infection. Childbirth was a perilous journey for both mother and child, with high rates of mortality due to infection and complications. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for families to lose half or more of their children before they reached adulthood. You, a product of a world where childhood death is rare, would witness the constant, casual loss of young lives, a psychological burden almost unimaginable. Medical knowledge, as we have previously touched upon, was rudimentary, often based on ancient Greek theories of humors, astrological alignments, and religious conviction rather than empirical observation. Treatments often involved bleeding, purging, blistering, or the application of herbal concoctions of dubious efficacy. Surgical procedures, performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions, were brutal and often fatal. A broken bone, a deep cut, a severe fever, any of these could swiftly become a death sentence. Your body, so accustomed to the swift and effective intervention of modern medicine, would be utterly unprepared for the slow, agonizing decline that followed even a minor ailment. You would witness suffering on a scale that would break your spirit, and experience pain that would shatter your resolve, with no hope of relief. Life expectancy for those who survived the perilous years of childhood was significantly lower than today, often averaging in the 30s or 40s. This was not merely due to battle or plague, but to the constant wear and tear on the body. The physical demands of medieval life were immense. Most people were engaged in strenuous manual labor, from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. Farming, building, crafting, these were physically exhausting tasks performed without the aid of machinery, often with poor tools and in harsh conditions. Arthritis, chronic back pain, repetitive strain injuries, and early onset of degenerative diseases would be common. Your body, accustomed to a sedentary lifestyle punctuated by voluntary exercise, would quickly break down under the relentless strain. Even the environment itself was a constant threat. Winters were brutal, with inadequate heating in homes that were often drafty and smoky from open hearths. Hypothermia and respiratory illnesses were common. Summers, too, could be harsh, with heat stroke and dehydration posing risks during long days of labor in the fields. Fires were a constant danger, especially in towns with closely packed wooden buildings, often leading to devastating conflagrations that could wipe out entire communities. Travel, too, was an ordeal. Roads were often poorly maintained, little more than muddy tracks infested with bandits. Journeys that now take hours by car would take days or weeks on foot or horseback, exposing you to the elements, to hunger, to the constant threat of ambush or accident. There was no guaranteed safety, no police force patrolling the highways. Justice, if it could be found, was often local, brutal, and arbitrary, dispensed by feudal lords or local courts with little oversight. Feuds between noble families, or even within villages, could erupt into localized violence, leaving you caught in the crossfire, with no recourse or protection. The mental landscape of the medieval person was profoundly different from your own. Life was precarious, unpredictable, and often brutal. The constant threat of famine, disease, war, and arbitrary violence would foster a pervasive sense of anxiety and fatalism. There was little concept of individual rights or personal autonomy as you understand it. Your life was largely dictated by your birth, your lord, and the dictates of the church. The lack of control, the constant struggle for survival, the proximity to suffering and death, it would weigh heavily on your psyche, leading to despair, depression, and a profound sense of helplessness. Your modern mind, accustomed to a degree of agency and predictability, would be utterly overwhelmed. We have traversed the battlefields, where steel met flesh in a gruesome ballet of death. We have lingered in the putrid air of medieval towns and villages, where disease and squalor were the uninvited guests at every meal. But the physical perils, the biological assaults upon your fragile modern constitution, are only half the grim ledger. To truly grasp why you would not survive, we must delve into the very fabric of medieval society, a structure so alien, so fundamentally opposed to your deeply ingrained modern values, that it would shatter your spirit long before any sword or plague could claim your body. Consider your innate sense of personal autonomy, your belief in individual rights, your expectation of upward mobility through merit. These are the bedrock principles of your existence, woven into the very fabric of your legal systems, your educational institutions, your social interactions. In the medieval world, they were utterly non-existent. You would be born into a rigid stratified society, a caste system enforced not by law alone, but by centuries of tradition, by the divine right of kings, and by the crushing weight of economic reality. Your birth determined your destiny with an almost inescapable finality. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Your lineage, not your talent or ambition, was your primary identifier. Imagine for a moment the psychological torment of being a serf. You are not a slave in the classical sense, bought and sold, but you are utterly bound to the land, and by extension to your lord. You cannot leave without his permission, a permission rarely granted. Your labor, the sweat of your brow, the aching in your bones, is not truly your own. A significant portion of your harvest, your time, and your very existence is owed to your feudal master. You would work his fields, repair his roads, serve in his household, and fight in his levies, all while struggling to eke out a meager existence for your own family on the scraps he allowed you. Your freedom, that precious commodity you cherish above almost all else, would be a concept utterly foreign, replaced by an unbreakable chain of fealty and obligation. Your modern indignation at injustice, your expectation of due process, your belief in universal legal standards, these would be met with blank stares or worse, brutal reprisal. Justice was local, swift, and often arbitrary. It was dispensed by your lord or his appointed bailiff, or by a village elder, with little recourse for appeal. There were no impartial juries of your peers in the modern sense, no complex legal codes designed to protect the individual from the power of the state. If you offended a noble, if you were accused by someone with more power or influence, your fate could be sealed with terrifying speed and brutality. Punishments were public and often gruesome. Mutilation, branding, flogging, the stocks, the gallows. These were not merely deterrents, they were spectacles, designed to reinforce the absolute power of authority and to instill terror in the populace. Your modern sensibilities, recoiling from such barbarity, would find no solace, no avenue for protest, no mechanism for change. You would be forced to witness, and perhaps even participate in, acts of cruelty that would leave you emotionally scarred and morally bankrupt. And the church, oh, the pervasive, inescapable influence of the church. In your world, religion is often a private matter, a choice, one among many belief systems. In the medieval world, the church was not merely an institution, it was the bedrock of existence, the ultimate authority, the undisputed arbiter of truth. Its dogma permeated every aspect of life, from the cradle to the grave. Every Sunday, you would be compelled to attend Mass, to listen to sermons delivered in Latin, a language you likely wouldn't understand, but whose message of sin, damnation, and eternal torment would be driven home through vivid imagery and terrifying narratives. Your modern, often secular or scientifically minded perspective, your tendency to question, to seek empirical evidence, would be not only unappreciated but dangerous. To express doubt, to question the authority of the clergy, to entertain ideas deemed heretical, was to invite swift and brutal retribution. The Inquisition, though it peaked later, was merely the formalization of a pervasive fear of heresy that ran deep through society. You could be accused by a neighbor, a rival, or even a child, and your fate would be sealed. Torture, designed to extract confessions, was a common tool. The threat of eternal damnation, a concept you might intellectually dismiss, would be a terrifying, tangible reality for the medieval mind, constantly reinforced by every sermon, every image, every interaction. The weight of this spiritual terror, the absolute certainty of hellfire for those who strayed, would be a psychological burden almost impossible for your modern mind to bear. Superstition, too, would be an ever-present force. Without scientific understanding of disease, weather, or natural phenomena, every unexplained event was attributed to divine will, demonic influence, or the machinations of witches. If your crops failed, it was God's wrath. If a child fell ill, it might be a curse. If a woman had unusual knowledge of herbs, she might be a witch. Your rational mind, seeking logical explanations, would be confronted by a world steeped in magical thinking, where omens, portents, and supernatural forces held sway. To dismiss these beliefs would be to invite suspicion, to mark yourself as an outsider, perhaps even as an agent of evil. Consider the sheer lack of comfort, the relentless physical discomfort that would define your every waking moment. There was no electricity, no central heating, no air conditioning. Your home, if you even had one that wasn't a shared hovel, would be dark, smoky, and cold in winter, stifling in summer. Illumination would come from sputtering rushlights or expensive candles, casting flickering shadows that would only deepen the pervasive gloom. The absence of sanitation meant that even indoors, the air would be heavy with smells you find repellent. Your sleep, accustomed to a comfortable mattress and climate control, would be constantly disturbed by cold, by heat, by insects, by the sounds of animals, by the ever-present threat of discomfort. The lack of technology would mean that every task, from preparing food to making clothes to building shelter, would be a laborious, time-consuming, and physically demanding ordeal. There were no washing machines, no dishwashers, no power tools. Everything was done by hand with crude implements, requiring immense strength and endurance. Your daily life would be a relentless cycle of physical labor, leaving you perpetually exhausted, your body aching, your hands calloused and raw. Communication beyond your immediate village would be virtually non-existent. No phones, no internet, no rapid postal service. News would travel slowly by word of mouth, often distorted and unreliable. Your world would be incredibly small, confined to the few miles around your home, limited to the people you encountered daily. This intellectual and social isolation, so alien to your hyper-connected existence, would be a profound shock. Your mind, accustomed to constant stimulation, to the endless flow of information, would find itself starved, forced to confront a reality stripped bare of the complexities and distractions you crave. Boredom, a concept you rarely experience in its purest form, would be a heavy, oppressive presence, only punctuated by the constant struggle for survival. And what of your mental health? In your world, there is a growing awareness of psychological well-being, of therapies, of support systems. In the medieval world, such concepts were utterly absent. Mental illness was often attributed to demonic possession, to sin, or to imbalances of the humors. Treatment, if any, could involve exorcism, prayer, or brutal physical restraints. There was no privacy, no personal space, no opportunity for quiet reflection or self-care. You would be constantly surrounded by others, forced into close proximity, without the escape valves you rely on to manage stress and anxiety. The constant fear of famine, disease, war, and arbitrary punishment, combined with the brutal physical realities of daily life, would lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and depression on a scale you cannot imagine. Without coping mechanisms, without understanding, your mind would fray, your sanity would unravel, leaving you a shell of your former self, perhaps reduced to madness, left to wander the roads or confined to a hovel, shunned and feared. Childhood itself was a brutal apprenticeship in survival. Children were not protected, cherished beings in the modern sense. They were miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household economy from a very young age. Education, beyond basic religious instruction, was a luxury for the privileged few. Most children would learn their trade through observation and imitation, working alongside their parents from dawn till dusk. Play was often a brief respite from labor, and childhood itself was fleeting, ending abruptly with the onset of puberty and the full responsibilities of adulthood. The high infant mortality rates meant that parents often guarded against forming too deep an emotional attachment to their offspring, a coping mechanism that would seem heartless to your modern sensibilities, but was a necessary shield against constant heartbreak. You, with your modern understanding of child development and the sanctity of childhood, would witness a constant, casual brutality towards the young that would sicken you to your core. Even the very concept of time was different. There were no precise clocks, no rigid schedules, no constant pressure to optimize every minute. Life was dictated by the rhythms of nature, the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, the demands of the harvest. This slower pace might seem appealing in theory, but in practice, it meant a life of relentless, unvarying toil, without the distractions and diversions you rely on to break the monotony. The sheer unpredictability of life would be a constant source of terror. A bad harvest meant starvation. A sudden flood meant ruin. A passing army meant pillage and destruction. There was no social safety net, no insurance, no government assistance. Your survival depended entirely on the whims of nature, the benevolence of your Lord, and your own physical resilience. This constant precarity, this absolute lack of control over your own destiny, would be an unbearable psychological burden. So when you fantasize about donning a cloak and sword, or living a simpler life in a bygone era, understand that it is a fantasy, divorced from the grim realities. Your body, your mind, your very understanding of what it means to be human, are products of a vastly different world. A world of comfort, of safety, of scientific understanding, of individual rights. The medieval world would not merely be uncomfortable. It would be a relentless assault on every aspect of your being. It would break you physically and mentally long before you could adapt. The very air, the very water, the very ground beneath your feet would conspire against you, and the people, shaped by a life of brutality and hardship, would find your softness, your sensibilities, your expectations, utterly alien, perhaps even contemptible. This is not a world where you could merely exist. It is a world that would grind you down, assimilate you into its harsh rhythms, or simply extinguish you with the same indifference it showed to so many others. And there are still more layers to peel back, more horrors to uncover, more reasons why your survival would be an absolute impossibility, reaching into the very core of human interaction and the raw, unvarnished truth of medieval existence. We have dissected the physical landscape of medieval peril, the battlefields, the disease-ridden towns, the constant gnawing of hunger and cold. We have peered into the rigid social strata and the oppressive shadow of the church, revealing how your modern mind would recoil from such an existence. But to fully comprehend the absolute impossibility of your survival, we must now plunge into the very depths of human interaction, the casual cruelty, the pervasive fear, and the utter indifference to suffering that define the medieval spirit. This is where your modern empathy, your innate desire for connection and understanding, would become not merely a weakness, but a fatal vulnerability. Imagine for a moment the nature of relationships in such a world. Your bonds would be forged not on shared interests or emotional compatibility, but on necessity and survival. Marriage was often an economic arrangement, a means to secure land, forge alliances, or simply to produce more hands for labor. Love, as you understand it, was a luxury, a fleeting emotion often secondary to the brutal realities of survival. Your family, while a vital unit of support, would also be a source of immense pressure and obligation. Children were an investment, a means to ensure labor and care in old age, their lives cheap in a world where so many perished before maturity. The emotional landscape would be stark, devoid of the nuanced psychological support systems you take for granted. Grief, though profound, would be a private burden, often suppressed in the face of constant, immediate threats. The casual, frequent death of loved ones would harden hearts, a necessary defense mechanism against perpetual heartbreak. Your modern sensitivity to emotional pain, your need for catharsis and understanding, would find no outlet, no solace. Consider the pervasive violence that permeated society, not just on the battlefield, but in daily life. Feuds between families, between villages, between lords were common. A perceived slight, a dispute over land, a stolen animal, any of these could escalate into brutal, localized conflicts, where homes were burned, crops destroyed, and lives taken with terrifying impunity. There was no overarching state to enforce peace, no reliable police force. Justice was often taken into one's own hands, leading to cycles of vengeance that could last for generations. You, accustomed to a world where disputes are settled in courts of law, where violence is an aberration, would find yourself constantly on edge, living in a state of low-level dread, never truly safe, never truly at peace. The concept of compassion, as you understand it, would be a rare and often dangerous sentiment. In a world where resources were scarce, where survival was a daily struggle, empathy for the weak or the unfortunate was a luxury few could afford. The poor, the sick, the disabled, they were often seen as a burden, as objects of pity perhaps, but rarely as individuals deserving of sustained aid or support beyond the most basic charity of the church. Beggars, lepers, and the mentally ill wandered the roads, often shunned and feared, left to die in ditches or the cold. Your instinct to help, to intervene, to offer comfort, would be met with suspicion, or simply be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of suffering, leaving you paralyzed by a moral dilemma that had no good answer. The constant exposure to death, to suffering, to violence would desensitize you in ways you cannot fathom. The sight of a public execution, the stench of unburied corpses after a battle, the emaciated bodies of famine victims, these would not be distant news reports or fictional narratives. They would be immediate, visceral realities. Your mind, conditioned to filter out unpleasantness, to seek comfort and aesthetic pleasure, would be constantly bombarded by the grotesque, the horrifying, the utterly abject. This continuous assault on your senses and your sensibilities would either break you, driving you to madness, or force you to adopt a callous indifference, a brutal pragmatism that would fundamentally alter your very character, stripping away the layers of humanity you hold dear. And what of your identity, your sense of self, so intrinsically linked to your achievements, your choices, your unique personality? In the medieval world, your identity was largely collective, subsumed by your family, your village, your lord, your guild, your church. There was little room for individuality, for self-expression, for the pursuit of personal passions outside the rigid confines of your predetermined role. Your thoughts, your beliefs, your very existence were expected to conform to established norms. To deviate was to invite suspicion, ostracization, or worse. This suppression of the self, this constant demand for conformity, would be a profound psychological burden for a modern individual accustomed to celebrating their uniqueness. Consider the sheer lack of privacy. In a small village, everyone would know everyone else's business. Homes were often communal, with entire families and sometimes even animals sharing a single room. There was no quiet corner to retreat to, no personal space to call your own, no sanctuary from the constant presence of others. This relentless proximity, combined with the lack of personal hygiene, the constant noise, and the pervasive smells, would create a sense of claustrophobia, a constant, low-level irritation that would chip away at your mental fortitude. The very concept of time, as we briefly touched upon, was different, but its implications run deeper. Your life would be dictated by the seasons, by the sun, by the demands of agriculture. There would be no weekends, no holidays in the modern sense, beyond perhaps a few religious feast days. Work would be ceaseless, relentless from dawn to dusk, day after day, year after year. There was no concept of leisure time, no hobbies, no entertainment beyond simple storytelling, communal singing, or perhaps a rare festival. Your modern mind, accustomed to a clear division between work and leisure, to the pursuit of personal interests and the enjoyment of varied forms of entertainment, would find this existence profoundly monotonous, soul-crushing in its relentless, unchanging rhythm. The sheer boredom, punctuated only by moments of extreme physical exertion or terror, would be a slow poison to your spirit. Even the landscape itself would be alien and menacing. Vast, untamed forests, teeming with wild animals and rumored bandits, would separate communities. There were no clearly marked paths, no reliable maps, no GPS. Getting lost meant facing exposure, hunger, and the very real threat of wild beasts or desperate outlaws. The wilderness was not a place of recreation. It was a place of danger, a boundary between the known and the terrifying unknown. Your modern sense of security, your expectation of safe passage and reliable infrastructure would be utterly shattered. The absence of reliable information, of a shared body of knowledge, would also be a profound challenge. Without widespread literacy, without newspapers, without the internet, rumors and misinformation would spread like wildfire. Fear and ignorance would be easily manipulated by those in power. You, a person accustomed to instant access to verifiable facts, would find yourself adrift in a sea of speculation, superstition, and deliberate deception, unable to discern truth from falsehood, leaving you vulnerable to manipulation and paranoia. Ultimately, your lack of survival in the medieval world would not be due to a single dramatic failing, but to a profound systemic incompatibility. You are a product of comfort, of sanitation, of scientific understanding, of individual liberty, of legal protection, of psychological awareness, of endless information, and of relative peace. The medieval world, in contrast, was a crucible of discomfort, of filth, of superstition, of rigid hierarchy, of arbitrary justice, of psychological neglect, of pervasive ignorance, and of constant, casual brutality. Your body, pampered by modern medicine and nutrition, would succumb to disease or injury. Your mind, accustomed to order and predictability, would shatter under the weight of constant fear, suffering, and the overwhelming lack of control. Your spirit, nurtured by concepts of individual worth and freedom, would be crushed by the relentless toil, the pervasive injustice, and the utter indifference to human life. You would not merely die, you would cease to be the person you are, stripped bare of every modern comfort, every ingrained belief, every expectation. You would be reduced to a primal struggle for existence, a struggle you are fundamentally ill-equipped to win. The medieval world would not tolerate your softness, your sensibilities, your expectations. It would chew you up and spit you out, leaving behind nothing but bones and dust, a testament to the brutal, unyielding reality of a forgotten age. This, then, is the stark, unvarnished truth. There is no glorious last stand, no heroic defiance, only the cold, hard certainty of oblivion. And with that, our journey into the relentless, unforgiving reality of the medieval world draws to a close, for now.